Hi everybody. So I have kind of a special video today and I'm really excited about it and I hope that you guys find it fun. I have been thinking a lot about storytelling and what makes a story really last, and it cannot be denied that one of those stories is the story of Cinderella. The story of Cinderella has been around basically in my research since the 1600s, and then it was eventually written down from fable form by the Grimms, and then it has had many retellings, but there's certain things that are always in the story of Cinderella. First, there's always a forced marriage that is being confronted. There's always an orphan who has a stepmother who doesn't love her, who treats her unfairly. There's always a heroine and a villainess. There's always somebody who is a rescuer, and usually it's the fairy godmother. And there's always somebody who goes from obscurity to success, and there is somebody who has a happily ever after at the end. So those are like the key elements of the story of Cinderella. Some people don't like that because they feel like that the story of Cinderella, she's only valued because of her beauty. That's the only reason the prince remembers her, is because she is beautiful. And that is, I think, a valid point, but I think there's so many other things that are interesting in the story that I think that with careful management, the beauty subplot can be something that's minor and not the major takeaway that a child or that any of us has to take from the story. So let's talk about the different versions and why each of them I think are worth seeing and worth talking about. The first one I'm going to talk about is 1950 Walt Disney Cinderella. And I went through a phase where I was living in a really small apartment, and so I got rid of all my DVD cases at the time and I put them in a big binder to save space. Don't do that, it's really bad, but I promise these are not pirated DVDs. This is my real DVD. And so the Disney version of Cinderella is really interesting because it was kind of an actual Cinderella story. What had happened is the Disney company had gotten $4 million in debt, and they had basically three flops in a row with Fantasia, Bambi, and Pinocchio that had not done very well at the box office. And back then, they only had one shot to make back the money, the years and years and years of time that went into one of these films. So if they didn't do well, then there was no chance of later recouping the money that they'd invested. And it was made even worse by the fact that the Disney Studios was basically co-opted by the war effort to produce propaganda films in the late 40s, mid to late 40s. So now 1950s comes, they're $4 million in debt. They'd had a major strike that was a huge problem, and so Disney really needed a hit. And so that's why they went back to the princess stories that had served them so well in the Snow White. The character of Cinderella in the Disney movie has a lot of positive traits. She's very kind. She's very hardworking. Almost the whole movie, she is on her hands and knees, scrubbing, mopping, cleaning drapes, working really hard. That is good. That is good. If anything, a character like Rapunzel is more of a damsel in distress because she isn't really working. She's, baking pies and painting and just kind of sitting there in a tower. But Cinderella is actually working hard as a servant, and she still manages to be happy even though she's living this horrible life basically as a slave. There's also, of course, the mice in Cinderella and the birds, and the mice are kind of silly. But the Gus, and Jack, and so They work really hard. They try to make her dress, and of course it gets torn apart. And that's really sad. I mean, she's a good enough friend that she has these these friends who want to make her dress. And so in her ultimate point of despair, she is rescued by basically a mother character, the fairy godmother, who comes and saves the day and rescues her. And then she goes and meets the prince, and of course they do fall in love. But I think there's a good lesson that, all of us are in need of rescue from time to time. All of us have those moments where we need somebody to come and say, okay, I'm taking you. I'm going to make sure you have a great experience. I'm going to make this all work for you. And you just have to sit back and let it happen. And that's basically what happens to Cinderella. I remember a time in my life when my grandpa and cousin had died. And it was my first time ever losing anybody. And I was just so depressed and so sad. And my friend came over and said, all right, get in the car. We're going out. We're going to go to do something. And, she had it all planned. She paid for it. She made sure it happened. And it was a form of rescue. And so I feel like that is the major takeaway from Cinderella, is that her friends love her. And that is the thing that allows her to find true love, is because she has a good heart, she works hard, and she deserves to be happy. There is the heroine villain subplot in Cinderella, with Lady Tremaine is her stepmother, and she is definitely one of the most evil stepmothers. But there's a long line of heroine villainess within fairy tales, and so it's hard to fault Cinderella for following that storyline when almost every fairy tale does it. And it is, I think, a good message to learn for kids, that there is evil and there is good. And that's the whole point of a fairy tale, is to kind of teach those lessons. So the next version I wanted to talk about is the glass slipper. And this version is starring Leslie Caron, and it was made in 1955. It's kind of a totally different take on the character of Cinderella. She's kind of a jerk. She's very socially awkward. I think they didn't want to put too much dialogue because Leslie Caron couldn't speak English that well. And so she gets in arguments with all of the townspeople. Nobody likes her. Her family doesn't like her. And she ends up running away, and she meets this woman called Mrs. Toquette. Sorry, I have it written down because there's a lot of names. Mrs. Toquette, who's this eccentric thief who lives in this little cottage, and she becomes friends with Cinderella. And Cinderella comes, and her name is Ella in this story. Ella comes to visit Mrs. Toquette, and she ends up meeting the prince and the prince's cousin. And but they don't tell her that he's the prince. And so they actually have a really funny discussion, fight, and she ends up pushing him into the pool. And not knowing it's the prince. She thinks it's the baker's son. And so he actually ends up coming back and hunting her down, meeting her, and he invites her to the ball. And he actually tells her that she needs to learn to dance, because she says, oh, I can't come to the ball because I don't know how to dance. And he says, well, you need to learn how to dance, which is really funny because Leslie Caron, that's the only reason she's in movies, is because she's a great dancer. And so Mrs. Toquette ends up helping her to be able to assemble a dress and be able to go to the ball. And she learns how to dance, and there's actually 2 ballets, full ballets, in the movie. The ballets were done by Roland Petit, and the Ballet de Paris is in both ballets. So that's pretty amazing. It's something that you would never see in a movie now, to have 2 full ballets, but it's really special. So if you love dance, so that is the glass slipper. And then we have my personal favorite, We have The Slipper and the Rose. This was in 1975, and it stars Richard Chamberlain, and it's kind of more told from the prince's perspective. You see almost the first third of the movie before you're actually introduced to the princess. You get crazy songs. The songs are really weird. Uh, there's one called What Has Love Got to Do with Being Married? So Cinderella is invited, the whole family is invited to the ball, but the stepmother forces Cinderella to make the dresses for her and the two sisters. And she doesn't know how to do it. She doesn't know how to sew. And she's asked to make these dresses. And so she is just so upset. And it is actually then not for her own dress. It's to make these three dresses for the sisters and the stepmother. That then the fairy godmother comes in this version and saves the day. And that's where she really feels. She's actually not even like that disappointed that she didn't get to go to the ball. And it's at the end that the fairy godmother says, "Oh, I've got a dress for you too, so you should go." And so she goes to the ball, and they meet, of course, or they meet again, and they have that connection, and there's the whole lost slipper and everything, and it's the only version of Cinderella that I know of that actually goes beyond that kind of moment of the slipper and the rose. They actually are about to get engaged, and the king pulls Cinderella aside and says, "Look, you're really not doing a nice thing for the prince, because he's going to need somebody who is a royal to be able to serve with him and work with him." And it's a very practical actually explanation of why this is probably not a good idea. And to the movie's credit, she's like, "Okay, I kind of agree with you." And she gets sent away into exile. And the thing I love about it is that she's actually happy uh, in exile. She's happy, fine. She thinks about the prince. Oh, he was nice, but she's okay. She doesn't need that. She's just happy to not have to work so hard and to be a slave, and so she's fine. And then the fairy godmother actually comes and finds her in exile and says, "Hey, you remember that prince that you used to like? He's getting married, because he's about to get married to this other princess, and who he doesn't love, because it's arranged marriage." And so finally she decides, "Okay, I'm gonna come." So she shows up at the wedding actually in a wedding dress, and of course it takes everyone, and the king is really mad, but the fairy godmother takes him aside and says, "You know what? This is really the best thing for the whole kingdom. They all need to see that this true love happens." And so he ends up marrying Cinderella instead of this other woman. And so there's a happily ever after in After All. But it's a little bit of a different sort of take on it. It's not as, we saw each other, we knew we were right, and then we drove off into the sunset. There's a little bit more challenges. The next version is the 1998 version with Drew Barrymore, Angelica Houston, and Dougray Scott. And there's no magic in this version at all. Cinderella, her name is Danielle de Barbarac, and the prince and Danielle actually spend a lot of time together in this version. They meet because she is under disguise trying to free a slave, and she quotes philosophy to him. This is definitely the most educated Cinderella ever put on film, and they have a back and forth about the validity of freedom and what it means to be a person, and how you can't take away someone's humanity. And they talk about an ideal society. There's this library that they go to that seems to be all covered in ivy and in the middle of nowhere, and he reads to her passages from a book on their first date. It's very academic Cinderella. It's very exciting to me. And the Baroness is definitely the softest version of the Baroness, of the stepmother. Her name is the Baroness Radmilla de Ghent. And she is a little bit sympathetic. You kind of feel sorry for her. She says, I hardly knew your father. I hardly knew him. I just had to get married because I had to be married to live. And so you kind of understand a little bit about why it's kind of the opposite of the typical Cinderella story, where it's about meeting, getting married, you just met, you just saw each other, and yet you're destined for each other. Well, here's somebody who they just met, they got married, and it turned out it was not meant to be. But she knew that that's what she had to do to save her family. And this is also a version of this story that uses the liar reveal more than any other Cinderella that I've seen, where she spent a lot of time with the prince. And so when the prince finds out that she is really the servant, the slave, he's really angry. And he feels like, how could you lie to me? How could you be untruthful? And that's a different side of the of Cinderella that we have never seen before. And so people that feel like Cinderella is only valued on her looks, I don't think that they really have looked at the different versions, because there's lots of different things that make her valuable in different versions. And here it's her honesty, it's her heart that she shared with him, it's their philosophies and their debate. It's not just her beauty. If that was it, then why would he care so much about the liar reveal? If it was just that, oh, well, you're still pretty, and you're still pretty, you're pretty then and you're pretty now. But it's more than that. So this is also the only version that has a sympathetic stepsister. After a period of time, it's kind of like the glass slipper, but in the glass slipper, it's Cinderella who has the moment of realization where she needs to go and find her love. In Ever After, it's the prince who realizes that he's made a huge mistake with, and it's Leonardo da Vinci. It's also the only version that has a male fairy godmother. Is this Ever After? And so Leonardo da Vinci basically says, look, what are you doing? This is a great person. You really loved her. And so he goes off and he tries to rescue her. He even says, I came to rescue you. Well, it turns out she had actually just freed herself. And so she didn't need rescue. And he's the one that needs to be rescued by her and needs to be loved by her. And so they marry, and there is some sweet revenge at the end. So those are the four versions that I own that I know of. I'm sure there's others. I know there was one with Hilary Duff a few years ago that was modernized. What other ones do you like? And do you have problems with the Cinderella story? We use that term, that they're a Cinderella story in sports. There's even that movie, The Cinderella Man, which I think is the worst title for any movie ever. Especially a movie about a boxer. You don't want it to be named The Cinderella Man. But anyway, the whole story of Cinderella is about somebody who's working hard, who is a believer in dreams and the goodness of people, and she's saved from slavery and servitude, and given a happy life, and given the life of a princess. And some people may think that that is dangerous to teach your children, but I think that there is value in letting your children know that their dreams can come true, and that when they are at their lows, that there are people who are going to rescue them. They are beautiful. That's okay. It's not the full part of their beauty, of their value, but it is something that is important to let girls know, because they certainly aren't getting that message from everywhere else. So it's okay, I think. And also, Cinderella she's a good friend, she's loyal, and I think sometimes what can happen is we don't want our girls to be superficial. So therefore, we're going to try to be really gender neutral and try to get them to like things that are for boys. And, we try to, we're going to get the boys to like things that are for girls, when really we should just get them to like things. And so Cinderella, yes, is on the girl side of things. I still think it can be a useful tool if managed correctly, because there are going to be girls that like traditional sort of feminine things, and there will never be girls that don't want to be a princess. I grew up in a house where I had three younger siblings, and I saw my parents try to raise them at least moderately, in a moderately gender neutral way. And my sisters couldn't be more girly, and my brother couldn't be more manly. And my sister, when you asked her when she was 6 or 7, you asked her what she wanted to eat, she just said pink. That's what she wanted, was pink. And I mean, this was a family where my brother got dolls and my sister, could play with Star Wars toys. And so I think that no matter how hard you try, there are going to be certain girls and boys that gravitate to things that are royal, that are special, that are feminine, that are pink, and that are fairy tales. And that's okay, as long as it's managed correctly, and as long as we talk about it and we talk about the things we can learn from it, and we can use the story that has lasted this long in ways that are effective. And so let me know what you think. Do you think that the Cinderella is evil and this horrible thing, or do you agree with me that there are ways that we can use the story to actually be a fun tool and to be able to help our girls and our boys become better people and live happily ever after?